Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the sun no longer feels alive. It still rises over the horizon, but something about it is deeply unsettling. Its warmth is fading, its light is weak, and every instinct in your body tells you the world has changed. You don't know it yet, but you're about to live through what many historians now consider the worst year in human history. There are no scientists to call, no satellites watching the skies, no weather reports explaining what happened overnight. Only frightened whispers passing from one village to another as every sunrise grows stranger than the last. Some people believe the gods are angry. Others think the end of the world has finally arrived. No one suspects that the answer will remain hidden beneath ancient ice for nearly 1,500 years before modern science uncovers the truth. When people talk about humanity's darkest moments, they usually think of world wars, deadly pandemics, or collapsing empires. Yet centuries before any of those disasters, one forgotten year quietly pushed civilization closer to collapse than almost anyone remembers. The year was 536 AD. Across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, people woke up beneath a sky that looked completely unfamiliar. The sun still existed, but it no longer shined the way it always had. The Byzantine historian Procopius witnessed the strange sky with his own eyes. He wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, as though it had lost the power to shine. Imagine living in a world where every noon looked like late evening. At first, many believed it was only temporary, a strange season, an unusual year. Surely summer would arrive soon and everything would return to normal, but the warmth never came. As temperatures dropped, crops stopped growing the way they should. Fields that normally fed entire communities produced almost nothing. Farmers watched months of hard work disappear beneath an endless cold. One failed harvest became two. Food grew scarce. Prices rose. Families began eating less with each passing week, hoping tomorrow would somehow be better. Instead, tomorrow only brought more hunger. What caused the sky to darken? Why did the world suddenly grow colder? And how could one single year trigger famine, disease, and the collapse of entire societies? To answer those questions, we have to travel thousands of years into the past, to the moment everything changed. For centuries, people had watched the same sunrise. Empires rose beneath it. Kingdoms fought beneath it. Entire generations were born, lived, and died beneath its familiar warmth. Then, almost without warning, the sky began to change. Nobody heard an explosion. Nobody saw a giant fireball crossing the sky. The disaster arrived so quietly that most people didn't even realize it had already begun. They only noticed that every day seemed darker than the last. Ancient records from different parts of the world all describe the same impossible event. The sun lost its brightness. Daylight became weak. Even at noon, the world looked as if evening had arrived hours too early. The Byzantine historian Procopius wasn't describing a myth or a legend. He was writing about the world he was living in. He reported that the sun shone without brightness for nearly an entire year, leaving millions beneath an unfamiliar sky. At the time, nobody knew they were witnessing one of the largest volcanic disasters in recorded history. The eruption happened so far away that most survivors would never even know it existed. Yet, its effects reached nearly every corner of the planet. Scientists believe the eruption blasted enormous amounts of ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere. Instead of falling back to Earth, these tiny particles spread across the sky like a giant curtain, blocking sunlight for months. Think of it like placing a dirty piece of glass between yourself and the sun. The sunlight still exists, but far less of it reaches you. Now imagine that effect covering the entire planet for months instead of minutes. Without enough sunlight, temperatures began to fall. Growing seasons became shorter. Crops struggled to survive. Entire regions started producing far less food than they normally would, and people had no idea the worst was still ahead. Modern scientists confirmed this disaster by studying tree rings and ancient ice cores. Trees that should have grown thick during those years barely grew at all, leaving behind one of the clearest natural records of Earth's sudden cooling. The strange sky was never the disaster itself. It was only the warning. Hunger, disease, economic collapse, and death would soon follow, turning one unusual year into a catastrophe that changed the course of history. When sunlight disappears, the damage isn't immediate. The first few days feel unusual. The first few weeks feel unsettling. But after months of weaker sunlight, the Earth itself begins to change. Temperatures fall, seasons shift, and nature slowly starts breaking down. Scientists estimate that average temperatures across parts of the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 2 degrees Celsius. That number sounds small today, but for ancient farmers, it was enough to destroy entire harvests. A tiny change in temperature can decide whether millions of people eat or starve. Farmers planted seeds exactly as they always had. They waited for rain. They waited for warmth. They waited for summer. But summer never truly arrived, and every passing day made the harvest smaller than anyone expected. Imagine spending months growing food for your family, only to watch the crops die before they can be harvested. There are no grocery stores waiting nearby, no emergency food shipments. If the fields fail, your family eats whatever little is left, until there is nothing left at all. Across Europe and parts of Asia, harvest after harvest failed. Grain became scarce. Bread became expensive. Entire communities were forced to survive on smaller meals every single day, hoping the next season would somehow save them. Tree rings quietly recorded this disaster long before historians ever discovered it. Healthy trees produce thick rings each year. During extreme cold, they barely grow at all. Hundreds of years later, those trees would become silent witnesses to one of history's darkest chapters. Ice, buried deep beneath Greenland, tells the same story. Layer after layer, year after year, tiny particles of volcanic ash became trapped inside the frozen ice. More than 1,000 years later, scientists drilled into those glaciers and uncovered the evidence hidden within. The evidence from tree rings, ice cores, and ancient writings all pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't a local disaster. It was a global climate event, powerful enough to affect millions of lives across multiple continents at the same time. But here's the terrifying part. None of the people living through this disaster understood what caused it. They couldn't see volcanic ash floating high above the atmosphere. All they saw were empty fields, cold mornings, and a future growing darker with every passing season. And just as people began wondering whether life could possibly become any harder, another disaster quietly approached. Hunger weakens the body. Weak bodies invite disease. Within a few years, one of history's deadliest pandemics would arrive, turning a climate disaster into a human catastrophe. Hunger doesn't arrive all at once. It begins quietly. One smaller meal, one empty shelf, one family deciding to save a little food for tomorrow. At first, it feels temporary. Then, tomorrow comes, and there's even less than before. Families began rationing everything they had. Parents often skipped meals so their children could eat instead. Every piece of grain became valuable, and every harvest was measured not in profit, but in survival. As food disappeared, prices climbed higher than ordinary people could afford. A farmer who once traded grain with confidence now struggled to feed his own family. Hunger was no longer a problem for the poor alone. It reached nearly everyone. Markets that were once crowded with merchants slowly became quieter. There was little left to sell. Trade routes weakened. Supplies became unpredictable, and entire towns found themselves cut off from the resources they depended on. Imagine watching your neighbors grow thinner every single week. Imagine hearing fewer voices outside each morning because more people were too weak to work. Hunger doesn't simply empty stomachs. It slowly drains the strength from an entire society. When people become desperate, they begin making impossible choices. Do you eat your last bag of grain today or save it for next week? Do you help your neighbors or protect your own family? There are no easy answers when everyone is starving. History often celebrates kings, generals, and emperors. But disasters like this are experienced by ordinary people. Farmers, bakers, children, parents. Their names were never written down, yet they carried the greatest burden. Modern researchers believe these years of famine weakened millions of people long before disease appeared. A healthy body can fight infection. A starving body struggles to fight anything at all. Hunger was preparing the world for an even greater tragedy. The people living through these years had no way of knowing that history would eventually connect every piece of this puzzle. The dark skies, the failed harvests, the falling temperatures, and the suffering were never separate disasters. They were all part of the same chain reaction. Then, just as the world was beginning to adapt to hunger and endless cold, something invisible arrived. It traveled silently from person to person. It didn't care whether you were rich or poor, powerful or forgotten. Humanity was about to face the plague now known as the Justinian pandemic. 5 years after the skies first grew dark, humanity was still struggling to recover. Crops were weaker. Trade was slower. Entire populations had already been pushed to their limits. Then, in the year 541 AD, a new disaster emerged, one that people could neither see nor understand. Historians call it the Justinian plague. Today, scientists believe it was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same disease responsible for the Black Death centuries later. But for the people living through it, it felt like death itself had arrived at their doorstep. The disease spread along the busiest trade routes of the ancient world. Merchant ships carried grain, spices, silk, and unknowingly carried infected rats and fleas from port to port. Every successful trading network suddenly became a pathway for disaster. One of the hardest-hit cities was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. At its peak, it may have been home to 500,000 people. Within months, thousands were dying every single day. The Byzantine historian Procopius described streets filled with silence. Homes were abandoned. Businesses closed. Even those responsible for burying the dead eventually became overwhelmed by the sheer number of bodies. Modern estimates suggest the plague may have killed between 25 and 50 million people over the following centuries. While historians continue debating the exact number, there is little doubt that it reshaped entire civilizations. Why was the plague so devastating? One reason may have been the years that came before it. Millions of people had already endured failed harvests and chronic hunger. Their bodies were exhausted, making it far more difficult to survive a deadly infection. It was a cruel chain reaction. First, the sky changed. Then, the climate changed. Then, food disappeared. Finally, disease swept across a population that had already spent years struggling simply to stay alive. Looking back, it's easy to see these events as separate chapters in history, but the people living through them never had that luxury. For them, one disaster simply blended into the next until suffering became the new normal. But despite everything humanity had endured, the story wasn't over. In fact, some of history's greatest recoveries began after its darkest moments. To understand why, we have to look beyond survival and ask an unexpected question. How did this disaster reshape the future of civilization? History often remembers disasters for the lives they take, but it rarely asks what those disasters leave behind. Sometimes, the greatest changes in civilization begin with unimaginable suffering. The year 536 wasn't just a catastrophe. It became a turning point that quietly reshaped the centuries that followed. When millions of people disappear, the world doesn't simply continue as before. Farms are abandoned, villages become empty, trade routes fall silent. Entire regions that were once full of life begin returning to nature. Civilization itself starts pulling backward. The Byzantine Empire, one of the most powerful states on earth, suddenly found itself fighting battles with fewer soldiers, collecting fewer taxes, and trying to govern a population that had been devastated by years of crisis. Even great empires have limits. Historians still debate exactly how much the climate disaster and the plague changed history. But many agree they weakened governments across Europe and the Mediterranean, making future invasions, political instability, and economic decline much more likely. Yet nature slowly began healing. The ash eventually settled back to Earth. Sunlight returned, temperatures recovered. Fields that had remained barren for years slowly became green once again. The planet had survived, even if millions of people had not. Recovery did not happen overnight. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing except hardship. Children born after the volcanic winter inherited a world that looked completely different from the one their grandparents remembered. If you had survived those terrible years, you probably wouldn't have known why the sky changed. You wouldn't have understood volcanic aerosols or atmospheric cooling. You would simply tell your children that there was once a time when the sun almost disappeared. That memory would become a legend. The facts would slowly disappear. The science would remain buried beneath ice, trees, and layers of volcanic ash, waiting more than 1,000 years for someone to uncover the truth. Today, satellites watch volcanoes from space. Scientists analyze air trapped inside ancient glaciers. Climate models recreate events that happened nearly 1,500 years ago. Humanity finally understands what the people of 536 never could. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of this story. Humanity didn't defeat the darkness by fighting it. We defeated it by understanding it. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't surviving history. It's finally learning why it happened. For more than 1,000 years, nobody knew what truly caused the darkness of 536. The people who lived through it had only fear, rumors, and prayers. The evidence they needed was hidden inside the earth itself, waiting patiently for future generations to discover it. The breakthrough began in places almost nobody lives: Greenland, Antarctica, endless fields of ice stretching farther than the eye can see. Every winter added another thin layer of snow, quietly preserving a record of Earth's atmosphere year after year. Scientists drilled deep into those glaciers, pulling out long cylinders of ancient ice, known as ice cores. Each layer represented a different year, almost like turning the pages of a history book written by nature itself. When researchers reached the layer corresponding to the year 536, they found something unexpected: tiny particles of volcanic ash. Invisible to the people who lived through the disaster, but perfectly preserved inside the frozen ice for nearly 15 centuries. Those microscopic particles became the first major clue. They proved that a massive volcanic eruption had filled the atmosphere with ash and sulfur. The sky wasn't cursed. It wasn't supernatural. It was responding to one of nature's most powerful forces. But scientists didn't stop there. They searched for more evidence. If the planet had truly become colder, nature itself should have recorded that change somewhere else. It turns out, it had been doing exactly that all along. Trees grow a little every single year. During warm seasons, they produce thick rings. During cold seasons, they grow much more slowly. By counting and measuring those rings, scientists can reconstruct climates from thousands of years ago. Across Europe, Asia, and even North America, researchers found the same pattern. Tree rings suddenly became much thinner, beginning in the year 536. Different forests, different continents. The exact same signal. When historians compared those scientific discoveries with ancient writings, everything suddenly fit together. The dim sun described by Procopius, the failed harvests, the cold summers, the volcanic ash. Independent pieces of evidence had all been pointing toward the same conclusion. For centuries, people believed the darkness of 536 was a mystery that could never be solved. In the end, the answer wasn't hidden inside a lost library or an ancient temple. It was written into the planet itself, patiently waiting for humanity to learn how to read it. By now, you might be wondering whether something like this could happen again. After all, volcanoes haven't disappeared. The Earth is still alive beneath our feet, and somewhere, right now, molten rock is slowly building pressure deep underground. The real question isn't whether volcanoes still erupt. It's whether another eruption could darken the sky the way it did in 536. The answer is yes. Scientists know that powerful volcanic eruptions have happened many times throughout Earth's history. Some were even larger than the eruption believed to have caused the disaster of 536. Nature has never promised that such an event will happen only once. One famous example is the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. It released so much ash into the atmosphere that the following year became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed across Europe and North America, reminding humanity that volcanic winters are very real. Snow fell during months when it should have been warm. Harvests failed again. Food became more expensive. Thousands of people suffered because of a volcanic eruption that happened on the other side of the planet. Once again, The atmosphere connected the entire world. The difference today is knowledge. Ancient civilizations could only watch the sky and wonder what was happening. Modern scientists monitor volcanoes with satellites, aircraft, seismic sensors, and thousands of instruments spread across the planet. We can often detect warning signs long before an eruption begins. That doesn't mean humanity can stop a supervolcano. We can't. But understanding how these events work allows governments to prepare, scientists to issue warnings, and communities to respond far more effectively than people could 1,500 years ago. Researchers continue studying ancient disasters because every discovery helps prepare us for future ones. Ice cores become climate records. Tree rings become timelines. Even tiny grains of volcanic ash become clues capable of protecting millions of lives. It might seem strange that a frozen glacier can teach us about the future, yet that's exactly what science does. It studies yesterday so humanity can make better decisions tomorrow. Every layer of ice is a lesson written across time. The people of 536 never learned why their world suddenly changed. They lived with uncertainty until the end of their lives. We are the first generation capable of reading the evidence they unknowingly left behind. That knowledge is one of humanity's greatest achievements. But perhaps the most important lesson isn't about volcanoes at all. It's about how fragile civilization really is. Sometimes, everything people depend on can begin changing because of a single event they never even see. And history has shown us that nature doesn't need permission to rewrite the world. When we study history, we usually remember the names of emperors, generals, and kings. We memorize the dates of great battles and the rise and fall of powerful empires. But the true story of the year 536 belongs to people whose names were never written down. Ordinary families became the real victims of an extraordinary disaster. Imagine being a farmer in the year 536. You wake before sunrise, just as your parents did, and their parents before them. You work the same land, plant the same seeds, and trust the same seasons. Then, without warning, the rules you've relied on your entire life suddenly stop working. Every morning, you search the sky for signs that the warmth has returned. Every afternoon, you inspect your crops, hoping they've somehow recovered. Every evening, you go to bed, wondering whether your family will have enough food to survive another week. Now imagine being a child during those years. You don't understand volcanic eruptions or changing climates. All you know is that your parents look more worried every day, meals become smaller every month, and the adults whisper after they think you've fallen asleep. History often describes disasters using numbers. Thousands dead, millions affected, entire empires weakened. But numbers don't capture what it feels like to watch your neighbor's house slowly become empty, or to realize you'll never see a familiar face again. This is the side of history that rarely appears in textbooks. Not the decisions made inside palaces, but the quiet struggles inside ordinary homes. The parents trying to stay hopeful, the children asking questions nobody could answer, the families doing everything they could just to survive another day. If you had lived through those years, you probably wouldn't have believed future generations would ever know your story. You would have assumed your struggles would disappear with time, just like countless lives before yours. In many ways, you would have been right, yet pieces of their lives survived in unexpected places. Inside ancient diaries, inside abandoned villages, inside the rings of old trees, inside glaciers that silently preserved the ash floating through their skies. Nature remembered what humanity almost forgot. Perhaps that's one of the most remarkable things about science. It gives a voice to people who can no longer speak. Every discovery helps reconstruct lives that disappeared centuries ago, allowing forgotten generations to tell their story one piece at a time. The people of 536 never knew their suffering would help future generations understand the power of nature. Their names may have vanished, but the lessons they left behind continue shaping science, history, and our understanding of the world. And those lessons matter now more than ever. The year 536 eventually came to an end. The skies slowly became brighter. Crops gradually returned. Children once again played beneath warm sunlight. But history never truly returned to the way it had been before. Some events leave scars that last for generations. Entire families disappeared from history. Villages were abandoned. Kingdoms became weaker than they had ever been before. Yet humanity endured. Against impossible odds, our ancestors survived one of the harshest periods civilization had ever experienced. Their survival wasn't guaranteed. If the volcanic winter had lasted only a little longer, if harvests had failed for just a few more years, or if disease had spread even further, history might have taken a completely different path. The world you know today may never have existed. Think about that for a moment. Every invention you've ever used, every language you've ever spoken, every nation that exists today, all of it depended on countless generations surviving disasters they never understood. The people living through the darkness didn't know they were protecting the future. They weren't trying to make history. They were simply trying to survive until tomorrow. Sometimes, survival itself becomes humanity's greatest achievement. Even now, the Earth continues changing beneath our feet. Volcanoes still erupt. Climates still shift. Nature still reminds us that human civilization is far more fragile than we often believe. The difference is that today, we have the ability to understand what our ancestors could not. Every ice core drilled from a glacier, every tree ring measured inside an ancient forest, and every forgotten document translated by historians adds another piece to humanity's memory. Together, they tell a story that no single survivor could ever have understood alone. Perhaps the greatest lesson from the year 536 isn't about volcanoes, famine, or disease. It's about perspective. The people living through history rarely realize they're making it. They simply wake up each morning and keep moving forward. The next time you step outside on a bright summer morning, take a second to look up at the sun. Its warmth feels ordinary because you've never known a world without it. But for millions of people nearly 1,500 years ago, even daylight became something they could no longer take for granted. History isn't just the story of kings, wars, or forgotten empires. It's the story of ordinary people surviving extraordinary moments. The year 536 reminds us that civilization is more fragile than it seems. Knowledge is more powerful than fear. And sometimes, the greatest mystery isn't how the world almost ended, but how humanity found a way to keep going.